Well, thank you all for having me. I'm a newbie to Matthew 25, and really honored to share this space and hold this space with you all. A space of paradox, of lament and joy, of resurrection and accident, of already but not yet, that we're all walking. And I know you all have come, some of you today and some of you yesterday, from different places and are tired. So I just want to give you permission. We're talking, the theme of the conference is limits and contending for hope in the midst of limits and in dark places. And honor your limits where you're at. I know we've been sitting and listening, and so maybe you need to close your eyes and take a pew and lay down for this, or maybe you want to get up, and because the pews are kind of uncomfortable, right? they're not the most relaxing. So feel free to use this time and honor your body as you just hopefully some of these words will stick with you, and if not, then that's totally fine too. God will use whatever God wants to use. So in 2009, I was a fresh college graduate, and I had grand visions of changing the world. Like many new college graduates, especially Wheaton College graduates, which is my alma mater, I was full of ideals and ambition, and I ended up getting a job at a nonprofit that ran a conference for church leaders in Europe who weren't very well connected and didn't have a lot of support. It was really meaningful work, and I gave it my all. My coworkers were also really idealistic and servant-hearted, also recent college graduates, and we just dedicated ourselves to this mission and did our best to execute all these ideas that our executive director had. And the last few weeks before the conference, our 8-hour days started turning into 9-hour days and 10-hour days, and just started working so much overtime. And then as we got toward the conference, we took a plane and we brought these huge suitcases full of binder material because we were collating all the notes from the different speakers and putting them into the binders for our conference attendees. So we were just trying our best to serve our participants in every way. So we got these huge binders, and we just hit the ground running, even though we had jet lag and we're coming from the other side of the world. And so we had all these things to sort out, right? And I was running back and forth in the hallways. I wasn't getting very much sleep. I don't remember what I ate at all during that week, except for one meal where we went out to get Hungarian food, and I remember things on the menu like wild boar stew and venison goulash. So I think I had something like that. And then by the end of the conference, I was just spent. I was just at zero. And my husband met up with me, and we took another 2 weeks in Europe. So we went to Italy and Spain, and I just remember staring out at these beautiful vineyards and not being able to absorb anything. I was just so numb from how much I had poured myself out and just ran myself into the ground serving. So this is one of the first experiences in my young adult life where I came up against what happens when we regularly push ourselves beyond our limits, even if it's in necessary work and meaningful work in service of God and others. I burned out, basically, and these activities that once glowed with purpose and joy and meaning suddenly became dull and lifeless, and I became numb. So tonight we're going to talk about a theology of limits, which Benjamin and Christine have already set us up for, and I want to just bring it down into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of what that means for us and how we can honor our own limits in the justice and mercy work that we're being called to. because we want to be able to do this work over the long haul, and we want to be able to do it sustainably. So that means we need to honor that we're human beings and we're creatures and not God. We're not superhuman. But before we dive in, I just want to give us some space to check in with our bodies. I'm going to channel some of Cindy, who led, I came here yesterday for the silent retreat. So Cindy led several of us in her spiritual direction type of way, and I'm going to channel some of that spiritual direction and that creating space for some breathing in silence right now. So go ahead and close your eyes with me. And let's just take some deep breaths together. Inhaling through your nose, exhaling through your mouth. Bringing your attention from all the monkeys jumping around in your head down towards your core. Just noticing the rise and fall of your chest. Noticing how it feels for the air to come in and out of your lungs. I wonder what you're carrying today into this room. And I wonder where you feel that in your body. And if you'd like to, you can even place a hand on that part of your body where you feel that you are carrying something. And how does your body feel right now? Let's just take a moment to check in. When I say the words limits or limitations, or as you've heard that word spoken by others, what feelings or reactions are coming up in your own body? Just go and notice and name that without judging anything. Let's take a deep breath together, and as we exhale, let's just release that to our Creator. And know that all of that is entering into dialogue with the Spirit and who's among us and dialoguing with us as we engage with these themes. Lord, we just bring to you the tender places in our bodies and in our souls, and open those up to you right now, to your gentle touch. In Jesus' name, amen. So that conference planning job that I had was one of my first in my young adult life, but definitely not my last experience with limits. The next major encounter started just a month after that conference in Europe. I started having pain in my left ankle, and after a couple of weeks, I tried to ignore it and it didn't go away, and then it spread up to my left knee, and then it spread up to my left hip, and then up to my shoulder. And as you can imagine, I went to see lots of different doctors and tried lots of different treatments, and none of those really stuck. So I just ended up, after a few months, calling it chronic pain. And then all of a sudden, all these things that I had taken for granted and thought of as normal activities became challenging and sometimes impossible, like walking up the stairs or walking down the block without limping, or carrying laundry up the stairs. dancing at a wedding, hiking with friends. The hardest part, though, wasn't the physical pain. It was the emotional and spiritual confusion I had. As a young 20-something, I felt that this just wasn't the way it should be, that something was wrong, right? Either with my body or with my faith, or there's something I did, right, that made this happen. And, I had friends serving in missions in Africa or teaching in South America or going salsa dancing, and I was sitting on a futon in Wheaton, Illinois with my foot propped up all day, and just the reality, what I wanted to be my reality and what was my reality just were so at odds, it just felt unbearable. And it took me years to come to a different perspective on my limits. And Benjamin, has kind of touched on all of these things, how we are limits, being liminal creatures is part of the human condition, is this spectrum that we're all on between ability and disability, and we will all fall somewhere along that spectrum. But learning and just embodying and coming to terms myself that having a body where limits are normal and part of having a human body was really huge for me in coming to terms with my pain and being able to accept that, and then slowly starting to heal, even though I sometimes still have flare-ups and pain. So going back to the check-in we did earlier, I wonder what came to mind for you all as I said the word limits or limitations. What emotions came up? Did you have curiosity or relief maybe, or maybe resistance to the idea of limits? For me as a 23-year-old, coming to terms with limits for the first time, my own limits brought up feelings of failure and lack and incompetence. Why couldn't I do these things that all my friends were doing? What was wrong with me? Why wasn't God answering my prayers to get better? Even my own inability to cope with my limits, I started having mental health issues. I started falling into anxiety and depression. Those became their own set of limits, and then I was beating myself up for not being spiritually stalwart enough to handle this pain, and not having enough faith and not trusting in God enough. Feeling like life was too hard to handle at times. And I wonder if any of you have had those kinds of thoughts come up as you come up against your own limits. Maybe you have a chronic illness or some form of pain. Maybe you get tired a lot sooner than you would like to, and maybe you're not able to say yes to all the things that you would like to say yes to. Maybe certain social situations really stress you out. I know after the pandemic, a lot of us I feel some social anxiety in just large rooms of people. Maybe you're struggling to get up in the morning. And I think all of us are overwhelmed by all the impending crises and news that's coming at us from all corners, and all the different issues that we know are so close to God's heart and our hearts. And so hearing about them over and over and just getting in the nitty-gritty of those things hurts and feels like it's too much to bear sometimes. Our society and even often our churches have done a really good job telling us that we should just push through whenever we come up against our own limits. And there's whole industries built around overcoming limits, whether that's anti-aging or space colonization. And our technology often pushes us to be present in ways that we never were asked to before, to be available to people 24/7, to be responding to things, to be receiving news, giving us the illusion that we can just be present to unlimited numbers of people and situations beyond our physical boundaries. And in our churches, there's often an emphasis to serve above and beyond, often beyond our physical capacities. Bible verses like Philippians 4:13 can get misused, right? I do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And then that becomes a call to be at church at all times of day or night. I've been in churches where it feels like the way to be a good Christian is to be there whenever the doors are open. And then that ends up justifying pushing our own needs to the back burner, our own physical human needs for sleep and rest and food. And the pandemic was a wake-up call for many of us. It raised questions about why we're so focused on economic development at the cost of our health and our essential workers. And it was also a warning sign from the earth about exceeding limits, right? That cutting down forests and bringing human civilizations closer to wildlife bring us into contact with new viruses, and we're kind of coming towards the capacity of the Earth's limits, as we all know. But many of you all working with vulnerable communities probably felt like your work ramped up during the pandemic. There's been more needs exposed and more people falling through the cracks and more inequities to be aware of. I'm sure that has led to its own set of symptoms for many of you all, physical or emotional or mental symptoms, and burdens that you're carrying. So I want to tell you all today, Matthew 25 community, that it is okay to stop and rest. It's okay to have limits. The disability theologian Deborah Beth Creamer calls limits a neutral and unsurprising part of being human. So in other words, having limits is part of how God created us as one of many of his beloved creatures, living in interdependent community, not independent self-reliance. And when we come up against our limits, we're coming up against a really essential truth about our humanity, about who we are and who we are not. We're not God, even though we would like to be sometimes. We would like to save people and jump into situations. We are not superwomen. We are not supermen. We are creatures. We are embodied souls and ensouled bodies. We need food, sleep, clothing, housing, Sabbath, community, regular rhythms of work, play, and rest. And we all operate on this spectrum of abilities. In different seasons, we might be capable of more or less, and that's all okay. I like to think of Bible stories as prisms, and you look at one story, you look at a story through one lens and you see one aspect of God's truth refracted. So since we're talking about coming up against limits, I want to take a look at a couple stories from the Bible through the lens of limits. The first story is a story of exceeding limits, and the second is a story of working within limits. So the first story is in Genesis 3, and we all know that story. It's the story of the fall. And Adam and Eve disobey God's command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So it can be read as a story of disobedience, of believing in lies rather than truth, of not trusting in God's abundant goodness towards us, and suspecting that God is holding back something from us. But it can also be read as a story of what happens when we exceed our limits. So in verse 4, the serpent tells the woman, "You won't die. God knows that the moment you eat from that tree, you'll see what's really going on. You'll be just like God, knowing everything, ranging all the way from good and evil. And Eve, hearing that, bought into that promise of being like God and knowing everything. So she sought to overcome the limits of being human, which is by its very nature to be bound to a certain space and time and not to be able to know everything. We can only be present within the boundaries of our own skin and be right here, right now. So we all operate from this partial unknowing, this limited human perspective of being on planet Earth, not being omnipresent. So we can't know the future, and we can't see exactly how things happened, and we can't know the exact cause and effect of everything. There's lots of questions for which our only answer is, we don't know. But Eve really wanted to know, so she ate the fruit. And I don't blame her. If I were in her shoes, or in her bare feet, I guess, I would feel that same desire to know why things are the way they are, the questions that Benjamin's wrestling with. I would want to reach beyond my own humanity and be godlike, and to achieve by my own ability and effort things that can only be given by God and received as a gift. And the consequences of Adam and Eve striving to be more than human is that God reinforced their limits. God says that he's going to multiply Eve's pains in childbirth and make getting food from the ground difficult and toilsome. You started out as dirt, God says in verse 19. You'll end up as dirt. So I'm not trying to say that if you're having pain, it's your own fault, or that all of our pain and disease is the result of the fall, or that all of our limits are necessarily God-ordained. But what I do want to get across is that as God's embodied creatures bound to planet Earth, recognizing that our lives have limits is part of honoring our creatureliness and God's good design. So we can't have everything, we can't do everything. And when we try to, that has consequences. And we see these consequences all the time, right? Especially in justice and mercy work. Greed pushes people to want more than they have, and that in turn ends up leaving other people with less. And our society's push to constantly grow the economy and produce more and more stuff has environmental limits. The climate is warming dangerously, and ecosystems are collapsing because we've gotten rid of so much of the habitable places for other species. And our water and air and soil has often been polluted beyond its ability to recover. So what we learn from reading the story of the fall through the lens of limits is that dishonoring our limits hurts us and hurts the rest of creation. So the second Bible story we're going to explore doesn't read at first as a story of working within limits. It's the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, which is found in all of the Gospels. So at first glance, this seems like a story of overcoming limits, but the theologian Sheriff Fee Nordling helped me to read this story differently. So we know that Jesus didn't just take on the form of a human being like a Halloween costume or a piece of clothing. The author of Hebrew writes that Christ took on flesh and blood in order to save us from ultimate death and join us to God. Chapter 2, verse 17 says that Christ had to become like us, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a faithful and merciful high priest in service to God. So let me repeat that. Christ became fully human in every way. So what does that mean, right? According to Sheriff Nordling, it means that Jesus didn't have access to a divine credit card. The New Living Translation of Philippians 2:7 says that he gave up his divine privileges, he took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. So he gave up his divine privileges. So while on earth, Jesus operated with the same limits that we do. He needed to sleep and eat. He needed to get away from the crowds and rest and be quiet with God. And you might add, and this is what I read into the story, that he operated with the same partial unknowing that we operate with. But the difference was that he maintained perfect obedience with the Father and this ongoing connection with the Spirit, which empowered his superhuman acts, what we see as his superhuman acts. So after Jesus finishes teaching the crowd, he realizes that it's dinner time and sits everyone down. And he wasn't thinking, okay, it's time to do a miracle, and I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna multiply these bread and fish. Instead, Jesus saw a need. He took inventory of what was available, which was a few loaves and fish, and then he worked with it. He gave thanks. He lifted this up, what he had, up to God, offered it to God, and started to split up the bread and the fish, and that ended up feeding the whole crowd. So he felt God's nudging to feed the crowd, and then he did what he could within his limits, and then God did the rest. So what does that mean for all of us? How does the theology of limits help us as people who care deeply about justice and mercy, who are so aware of the groans of people at the margins of society? How do we follow Christ and honor our own limits in our ministry? So I have 5 suggestions, and what I want to do is share each suggestion and then ask a couple of questions and leave about a minute for you all to engage with that question. You can pull out the pad that was provided in your white bag at registration to journal with, or you can just sit with God in silence in the questions. So first, knowing our limits, we operate with humility that we aren't going to solve the world's problems. We're called to do our part in obedience and let God do the rest. Often in our longing to help people who are hurt by injustice, we can perpetuate the same dishonoring patterns upon ourselves. So maybe your desire is to help low-wage workers who aren't getting paid fairly, and you overwork yourself in the process. Maybe you want to address environmental injustice, like issues of water, air pollution, but then you don't honor your own body's needs for clean food and healthy food and adequate rest. And maybe you run a ministry and God is calling you to walk alongside not only the people that your ministry is aiming to serve, but also to recognize the humanity and limits of your own teammates and yourself. So first, we're called to recognize that we aren't God and we aren't going to do it all. So I want to invite you all to sit with these 2 questions for a minute. What are my limits currently? And how is God inviting me into relationship with Him and others in light of those limits? I'll give you all a minute to sit with those questions. Yeah, the questions are, what are my limits currently? And how is God inviting me into relationship with Him and with others in light of those limits? So I asked the question about relationships because when we come up against what we can't do, that can be an invitation from God to be vulnerable with other people about our own weakness and our own inability to do something that we might really want to do. And that becomes an invitation to allow other people into that space with us, and also to ask for help and to let other people do things, to see that we're part of this web of dependence. So first, we operate with humility, knowing our own limits. And second, we pay attention to our bodies. So often our bodies are telling us that we've exceeded our limits before we're consciously aware of it. So pain, illness, and fatigue are all ways that our bodies can send distress signals. And also in the work that you all are doing, that we're doing, it can be really common to carry the pain that we're witnessing in our own bodies, that other people are experiencing with us. And we might have past experiences of pain that make it so that we're more sensitive to the pain of others and more ready and able to offer compassion. That might be part of our gifting and ministry. And Henry Nouwen called this being a wounded healer. But even so, it doesn't mean that we're ministering infinitely. We still rest when we're tired and sleep when we need to sleep. We need to offer ourselves the same care and compassion that God is calling us to offer to others. So a couple of questions for you all to sit with. What is my body telling me? And how can I respond lovingly to my body's needs? What is my body telling me? How can I respond lovingly to my body's needs? We're probably all wanting to just go back to our rooms and take a nap now, or just go to early bedtime. Bear with me for a few more. Third, whenever we are witnessing painful situations or walking alongside others going through painful situations, we need the time and space to metabolize things. We need to process pain and trauma in community. Otherwise, that pain and trauma gets stuck in our own bodies. And then pretty soon we can't handle any more input and we go numb. So we need to find ways to allow that pain to move through us and then release that pain. That means that lament and grief are going to be ongoing parts of our spiritual discipline. And I believe that there will be some space for that here at this conference, at this gathering. And I think as Anglicans, we do better at this than most other denominations. We have Advent and Lent built into our church calendar, and we do a really good job. I think we love those seasons as Anglicans, at least the churches that I've been into. But even beyond these church seasons, how can we make space for lament and grief in our parishes and our ministries? In the pandemic, right at the beginning of the pandemic, I hosted a lament circle for a few other women in my community, and we gathered around a bonfire in my backyard. And I gathered a bunch of rocks and put them to the side, and then each of us took turns picking up a rock and naming something that we were lamenting, and then putting that in the center of the circle to form like a circle around the fire. And then I led the women in this embodied liturgy of lament, and we did a lot of mirroring back and forth, that we saw each other and that we were honoring what each other were holding, and then offering that, releasing that up to God in a really like physical, motion-based way. And that was just a really powerful space. And so yeah, I wonder for you all, some questions for you. Is there pain that feels like it's stuck inside of me? And then what would it look like to process this pain through grief and lament with others? And I hope that as you're processing that question, that you'll have a chance to share that too during this gathering with others. So is there pain that feels stuck inside of me, and what would it look like to process that pain with others? So I talked about knowing our limits, working with humility, knowing that we're not God, paying attention to our bodies, and finding ways to metabolize, giving ourselves space to process the situations that we're bearing witness to. And then fourth, we can establish healthy rhythms of work and rest. So when I talk about honoring our limits, it doesn't mean that we don't have an intense season where we're outputting more than normal, but we do have to give ourselves space after that season to recover and bounce back. A friend of mine shared with me the metaphor of a rubber band. So the rubber band has some give, and you can push a little, and then it'll bounce back. But at some point, if you push too much and you don't give that rubber band space to bounce back, it breaks. So for every high activity season, we need an equal amount of low activity to give ourselves space to get back to equilibrium. I wonder how many of you all have been in a season of high activity and how long that's been going on for. So a couple questions for you all to ponder. What would it look like to give myself, and maybe my team, if you're leading a team, an equal amount of downtime for all the uptime that we've been outputting more intensely? And what does it look like to have a healthy rhythm of work and rest? And finally, as we think about how we can honor our own human limits in our justice and mercy work, we can work creatively within our limits, with the limits we've been given. I told you the story about Jesus feeding the 5,000 through the lens of limits. So he started by taking an inventory of what he had for food, and then he worked with it. So I want to tell you another story, and this story is in my book, Hurting Yet Whole. It's a story of my friend Laura, who I interviewed for the book, and she's an artist and a teacher who has a condition of hearing loss called cholesteatoma. So over this period of 10 years, she went through about 11 surgeries. Over half of them were to correct her hearing loss. And she spent so much time in doctors' waiting rooms and lamenting the fact that she wasn't doing the things that she would like to be doing, building relationships, hanging out with friends. But she chose to take inventory of what she had and work with it. So her master's thesis focused on visualizing the activity of bees. Because she was experiencing hearing loss, she wanted to find ways to experience sound that wasn't audible. So she did artwork that made bees' activity and sound visible. And then she also spent so much time in doctors' waiting rooms that she started to make art while she was waiting. So she had these little portable pieces of art. And I wish I had a picture, but if you're interested, I can point you in her direction toward her blog, that she made in these little like the little metal mint containers. And she would take them from waiting room to waiting room and do her artistic work in these 15-minute increments of time while she was waiting at doctors' offices. And this is what she writes about that experience on her blog. The time I spent in doctors' waiting rooms shaped the way I make. I no longer rely on the four walls of a studio or long periods of interrupted time. I do most of my making in increments of 15 minutes or less. Like a honeycomb, those tiny spaces of time can be productively filled. A jar of honey is merely 1,000 tiny combs combined. So those are really good words for me as a mother of young children. I don't get lots of uninterrupted time these days, but they were also really good words as I was doing this research and interviewing people, as I was processing my own limits with chronic pain, that showed me that it's possible to do meaningful and beautiful things while honoring our limits and working within them. And I love that Laura was able to take something that first appears to be a roadblock in her path and turn it into a source of art and creativity. So, a couple questions for you all to consider. What are the roadblocks in my life and ministry, or what feels like a roadblock right now? And how might God be inviting me to creatively engage these roadblocks? So, how do we honor limits in justice and mercy work? First, we operate with the humility that we are not God. We are God's creatures. We pay attention to our bodies. We give ourselves space and time to metabolize the painful situations we're encountering. And we establish healthy rhythms of work and rest. And we work creatively within and with our limits. I think these things might seem simple and obvious, but it took me a really long time to actually embrace them and put them into practice, coming from this really driven background and from a society that drives us and pushes us to just go, go, go. And I think if all of our parishes and ministries started asking these questions, it would be really transformative to how we operate and how God can operate through us, in and through us. And I'd love for you all to share some of what you've been thinking about as you've answered these questions, engaged with them, with each other throughout the rest of the gathering as you have time and space to chat. So what does it mean to honor limits in justice and mercy work? It means that we recognize we're not God. We don't know everything. We can't do everything. But we're placed in community and in relationship with our Father. We're given a Spirit who grows the gifts of love, joy, peace, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And patience, I forgot that. We act in obedience to what has been revealed to us, walking towards wherever sense God is calling us, and working with and within our limits, offering up to God what we have, and then seeing how God can work with it. So I'll leave you all the words of the poet and farmer Wendell Berry. He writes about limits in this poem called The Real Work. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And when we no longer know which way to go, we have begun our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. So amen. In our pain and limits and roadblocks, may we each learn, like the streams, to sing.